Bess will tell you when to begin.
When ready.
Filming now.
Wait, no, don't forget, guys.
Hi, my name is Winstanely, and I'm going to be presenting on intelligence and one's environment. So I'm going to be arguing that paying more attention to the environmental factors on intelligence will increase personal and societal health, success, and equality. To do that, I'm going to address three main topics. The first is the Flynn effect, which is the documented rise in IQ scores over time. The second is a few specific factors which affect intelligence. And the third is John Locke's seminal ideas on intelligence. So the Flynn effect is named for James Flynn, who discovered it in the 1980s. He is a professor at the University of Otago in New Zealand. He discovered that IQ scores have been rising pretty dramatically since at least the 1930s, which is when IQ scores began to be measured. He discovered that it's about 3 points per decade. So people in the 1970s and even 1980 would score only about an 80 on today's IQ tests, even though the current average is 100. Notably, the Flynn effect is geographically independent, which means that it's observed in all countries where IQ scores have been measured for over a period of time. This graph shows a few different countries: Britain, Netherlands, Israel, Norway, and Belgium. So obviously this change is not only across different countries, but across different languages and across different cultures. So it's very significant. So James Flynn, in a 2006 lecture, notes that genetic selection is not enough to explain this phenomenon. He says that natural selection can't occur over 100 years to cause such a dramatic effect because genes don't change that fast. It's pretty simple. He also says that the difference can't be due to cultural shifts or in testing, the testing environment, which means because it's occurring over a bunch of different tests. So the only factor that's left is the environment and one's environment during development and cognitive development. So now I'm going to talk about a few specific factors which have been scientifically proven to affect intelligence. The first is one's social environment, especially during early development. This is very important. A study by Diana T. Slaughter at the University of Pennsylvania found that children who are exposed to more intellectual and verbal stimulation during their early development stages showed significantly increased IQ scores in their later stages. Another important factor on intelligence that comes from the environment is exposure to infectious disease. As this scattergram shows, countries that have much higher disease impacts tend to have lower average IQs, and countries with lower disease impacts have higher IQs. And you can see this negative correlation pretty clearly as all of these are centered on this rough line that goes downward. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about John Locke and his ideas on intelligence. He was a philosopher who lived in the 1600s, and he outlines a lot of ideas about experience-based intelligence and experience-based learning. He says that people need to be exposed to ideas and concepts, and they need to use their brain in order to develop the skills needed to think and formulate new ideas. He outlines this in one of his essays of ideas in general and their original. And in that essay, he notes that a child who is never exposed to color during their lifetime would never be able to conceptualize or understand what color is. And he generalizes this to intelligence in general and ideas in general. A child would never be able to formulate ideas without being exposed to different ways of thinking in their development. So this can be seen in a few different areas in the modern day. The first is that a few studies have shown that bilingual people are much faster at sorting information than their monolingual counterparts. This shows that people, when their brains are exercised differently, it not only affects just being able to do different things, but it affects their cognitive function as a whole. Also, there's been a spurt of recent activities and exercises which purport to increase one's fluid intelligence. And there's actually scientific backing behind these advancements. And it shows that using one's brain in a different way and exercising one's brain in different ways can affect one's intelligence very positively. So one argument against the environmental effect on intelligence was introduced by James Flynn himself, which is called the twin paradox. This chart shows a bunch of correlations between people and their intelligence. For example, siblings who are reared apart have about a 0.5 correlation with their intelligence, but identical twins, which are genetically identical, when they're reared apart, their IQs are extremely correlated, even higher than siblings when they're reared together, which would suggest that their environment is very different, but their genetics are the same, and their intelligences are coming out the same. So obviously, you could conclude that the genetics are what's driving the intelligence. However, it's important to note that the twins, when they're reared together, have an even higher correlation in their intelligence, and also a few recent studies have shown that one's genetics can actually affect their environment. For example, if you're genetically predisposed to be very good at basketball, you're more likely to seek out coaching and training to improve your skills even more. So one's genetics can actually create an environment, and if you have the same genetics as someone else, your environments will likely be very similar because you will seek out the same things and you'll have the same genetic predispositions. So we can conclude from this that the environment during development drastically affects one's intelligence, and from that we can conclude that paying more attention and improving these environmental factors can increase intelligence on a societal level. So how should we implement this? We need to increase awareness about all these environmental factors. Also, an important thing to note about this is that negative effects on intelligence from the environment often disproportionately affect minority groups. For example, this is a chart on lead exposure, and it's much, much higher in African Americans than it is for Mexican Americans or whites. And this shows that more attention to environmental factors on intelligence would disproportionately help these minority groups, which are disadvantaged. Also, we need to improve access to resources in general, such as resources which fight malnutrition and infectious disease, and improve access to areas with better socialization, especially during early development. So what would result from this? The United States would be much more competitive and productive on the economic level, as there has been shown to be a high correlation between national intelligence and productivity. It would increase equality, it would make the playing field just a little bit more level for different groups of people, and it would improve personal lives and society as a whole.
Thank you, Paul. For your first question, what information did you need that you were not able to find or locate, and how did you go about trying to find that information?
So I was looking at the Flynn effect at first, and I found that there's a very well documented rise since the 1930s, which is when testing of IQ started, but it's not very clear what happened before that. And I was looking to find out if there was any research done as to whether there were IQ gains in the past, because obviously the environment was still improving during this time. There was a drastic improvement in environment in the developmental environment from the 1600s until 1900. So if IQ scores were rising at the same rate during that whole time, people in 1600 would be, basically just rocks. So I wanted to figure out if there was any research which pointed to specific factors which affected this, and I couldn't find that, largely because the research is very hard to do. But I looked for it mostly in journals which study historical aspects of society.
Thank you. Now for your second question. What might be the real-world implications or consequences of your findings, and what would be the implications in your community?
So, as I said, this would implementing better awareness and better attention to environmental aspects